Welcome to the Protestants and Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Nat Nasworth, and I've been exploring the intersection of churches, Christians, theology, and public life for over 20 years as both a professor and a journalist. But I still have lots of questions. I invite you to continue learning with me as I interview interesting voices in this field. Welcome to Episode 1 of the Protestants and Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Nat Nasworth. My guest today is Carmen LaBerge. She is the host of Mornings with Carmen, which you can listen to every weekday morning from 7 to 9 on the Faith Radio Network. The show is also available on Google Play, iTunes, and other podcasting apps. Her previous show, called The Reconnect, was the National Religious Broadcasters Radio Program of the Year in 2018. She previously served on the board of the National Association of Evangelicals and has degrees from the University of Florida and Princeton Theological Seminary. Carmen is also a writer, and her most recent book is Speak the Truth, Bring God Back into the Conversation. Carmen, welcome to Episode 1 of Protestants and Politics.
Thanks, Nap. What a privilege.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring you on. Well, I guess I should say we've known each other a long time. We first met at the University of Florida as undergraduates, working together as volunteers in Young Life. For my first episode, I wanted to bring on a familiar voice.
We've been friends in the evangelical effort for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and also you have a lot of experience doing this sort of thing for radio. So I thought it would be a good idea as my first podcast, just to get a few tips from you and some ideas. So what are some interviewing tips you have, first of all, that I can take away from this?
Well, let me start with, let's cast a vision for this podcast. So let me turn the tables for just a minute. What are you seeking to achieve? And why would a person listen to the Protestants and Politics podcast?
Right. So this is a topic I've been studying for many years. And so I have connections both within, among practitioners, pastors, and evangelical leaders and Protestant leaders. And then also I have connections in academia. And that's like a lot of what I've done is to try to bring those two together. So I think in similar to my Protestants and Politics newsletter is to bring a lot of that information together, a lot of the research from academics and so forth, and then a lot of the ideas and knowledge that are coming from important evangelical and Protestant voices.
So I appreciate that. And you and I like to talk about similar things, and we actually like to talk to similar people. So my top tips maybe would be talk to people, invite people onto your podcast who genuinely interest and intrigue you. Because people are going to want to listen to you have a genuine conversation with somebody who you want to get to know a little better, or who has ideas that you either resonate with or, maybe gently push up against. And so the listener is the third person in the conversation all the time. And yet you're often, particularly in a podcast, you're not talking directly to them. And so I want to be asking questions that demonstrate I'm genuinely interested and intrigued by the person that I have invited onto my program.
Oh yeah, so basically, bring out of that person the ideas, to have that person's ideas brought into the podcast. I'm sort of the voice of the listener, wanting to bring out of them things that would interest them.
Absolutely. If you could imagine the listener sitting there saying, "I wish Nap would ask that person this question," and then you ask the question, you have hooked that listener, because that listener then gets it, that you're operating in the same space they're operating in, and you're asking questions that resonate with them. You're seeking answers that they also want. And so that would take me to my second point. So after you've invited people that genuinely interest you, then be honestly curious. And which means you're going to go into a conversation with a guest having really no idea where the thing might go. And so although you know what they've written, and maybe that is the substance that you've agreed on in advance that the two of you are going to talk about. I often find that something has happened in the last hour or 24 hours in the life of the person I'm talking with, and that will be the thing that ultimately they really want to talk about. And so be genuinely curious and sort of allow the conversation to go where it will. How do you frame the question to get them to talk about that? Well, part of it is if they're on platforms like Twitter, I definitely watch the Twitter feed of like tomorrow's guests on my show. Those are the 4 Twitter feeds that, if they're on Twitter, that I'm kind of watching today. So I am going to know if one of those 4 people is, hair on fire about something that is happening or some conversation somewhere, or if they've posted something new. I'm going to be aware of that. And that's going to be at their highest level of interest. And so asking a personal question that's obviously they've already revealed on social media, so it's not intimately personal. It's personal in a way that they've already made public. Sort of lets them know, hey, this is a person who is curious enough to follow me on social media, and they're asking a question that's important to me right now. Particularly authors who are like really prolific. So I'll use Os Guinness as an example here. By the time you get Os Guinness on for a conversation about a book that has been published, even if you get him on launch day, he already has his next book very, very far down the publishing gangplank, which means he's really thinking about the next book. He's not thinking about the book that he's supposed to be on your show talking about. Knowing that about him means you spend a few minutes covering the book that has just launched, and then you figure out how to get him into a conversation about what he's really passionate about, which is the book he's researching and writing right now. So not everybody is like that, but people who publish every single year, that would be one of the things that you could just put in your file and say, all right, this is a person who I know publishes once, twice, some of them 3 times in a 24-month cycle, which means by the time I get them on the show, they're actually already thinking about eating, drinking, and sleeping the next book, not the one that we're going to talk about today.
That's a really good point. Os Guinness is one of my favorite people to interview. I interviewed him several times over the years. And that was always like one of my last questions I would ask him. It was, what's your next book? What are you working on now? Mm-hmm. But yes, he was always working on something else.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So what else? Any other tips?
Yeah. I would also say, have like a go-to list of, some of them might be questions. Some of them simply might be conversation starters. So I have up in front of me, literally like on the wall, on a sheet of paper, big enough for me to read from where I'm sitting, three things. The 3 things that I have up there are tell me more. So my first one is tell me more, which is my go-to in a conversation a lot of times, particularly with people with whom I disagree. I actually want to know more about what they're saying. I want to get beyond their top line talking point. I want to see whether or not they just memorize someone else's talking point or if there is more there. So tell me more about that. And sometimes I will repeat back to them what I heard them say. So here would be an example. So Nap, you just shared that Os Guinness is one of your favorite authors. He's been one of your favorite interviewees over time. Tell me more about that. What is it about him or what he's writing or what he's thinking about or his viewpoint that you value so much that you would have him back again and again and again? Well, I'm going to provoke you then to talk about what you have learned from him or what it is about his viewpoint that you so value that you would platform him more than once, in an interview setting. So I'm getting you talking again about something you're obviously interested in talking about. So tell me more is the phrase that I have on the wall that reminds me in part to stay non-defensive, particularly if the person has gone down or is going in a direction with which I do not agree. I want them to keep going in that direction. I don't want to put a stumbling block in front of them, which means I don't want to become defensive. I want to allow them to run all the line out that they need to run on that. I also have on my list of off-the-wall questions, how does your faith inform that perspective? So after somebody has articulated something, particularly in the political realm, this is, I think, going to be important for you. So you've got a person who knows they're on a podcast at the intersection of faith and politics. So Protestants and politics. How does your faith inform that perspective? Or maybe for you, Nap, it's going to be, how does faith inform that perspective? Because it might not be the individual's faith, especially if you're talking to a journalist. It's not their faith that's the topic of conversation. It's the faith of whoever the person of interest is in the story. So how does faith inform that perspective? And then here's my other go-to, question or conversational hook. I'll take one word or phrase that the person who I'm talking with has just used, and I will ask them to define it. So, hey, Nap, you just used the term supersessionism. I'm going to need you to define that, or how are you defining that? So again, I'm being empathetic toward the listener who does not spend a whole lot of time, roaming around in theological words, particularly if as a Christian, I recognize there's some Christianese being thrown around, words that are commonly used in Christian conversations that are not commonly used in the parlance of everyday Americans, or words that are used in politics, acronyms that are used that we just assume everybody knows what they mean. Do you know the only reason that people today know that POTUS is president of the United States is because in the pilot episode of West Wing, they told everybody that. So it's not that long ago that people didn't even know what POTUS stood for. And so there are things that we know instinctively because this is our area where we talk all the time. We'll make reference to things. But if the listener doesn't know what we're talking about, they will tune out. So be prepared to make note of words that are used by your guest that regular people don't know what they mean, or those are words that are used differently by different people in the conversation today. Evangelical would be a good one. Pretty much any time anyone uses the word evangelical or evangelical, I ask them to define it. So when you say, I have lots of relationships in a network of evangelical leaders, I am immediately going to ask you, what does that mean? Because I have to tell you, I just heard a person who's identified as an evangelical leader on TV, or I didn't actually see it on TV, but it's all over my social media feeds, saying something that is as far from the gospel truth as I could ever imagine. And that person's being, publicly identified as an evangelical leader. So when you say that, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's actually when I had this idea for the podcast. I was thinking about calling it Evangelicals in Politics, but the word evangelical itself, it's so contested as far as like what the actual meaning is and everything that I decided to just go with Protestants in Politics, as a more broader term, and I wouldn't have to deal with that issue of how to define evangelical.
But I think that inviting your guest to define a word if they use it is a great way of not only allowing you to get them talking and find out sort of where they are on things, but it allows the listener to consider how they might answer that same question. The word love. Are you defining it as like Beauty and the Beast? Or are you defining it, as the love of God that endures forever? Are you defining it the way Paul describes it in his, Corinthian correspondence? Are you describing it, is it, what what love are we speaking? And when we would use a term like immigrant or enemy or neighbor, I think it's helpful to define the terms. And in the conversations that you were going to be having at this intersection of Protestant faith and people of Protestant faith and the politics of the day, words are going to need to be defined because we just live in this Humpty Dumpty reality where it's upside down and inside out, and words don't mean necessarily what we always thought they meant. And so, figuring that out publicly, I think is helpful.
Yeah, and you talk about politics a lot on your radio program, right?
Sure. I'm not sure I frame it that way. The way I describe it is the headlines. So we bring the mind of Christ to bear on the headline news of the day. The headline news happens to be consumed with politics. And so because we deal with headline news, we deal with politics.
Now, the reason I ask is, when you combine politics and religion, there can often be, it can be a very emotional topic, let's say. So when you come across that, I mean, how do you deal with delicate situations? Are you just sort of blunt, or do you like walk softly, or what's your approach to those situations?
I'm pretty straightforward in my approach. And I think that I am on air very much the same person that I am if you and I are sitting down and having a conversation, over a cup of coffee with our masks on. Or far enough apart that we don't have to be wearing masks, which would be my preference. But even masks is a political topic today, and masks in church, right. So my text line is always open during the show, and there could be, there's 100,000 people out there listening live on the radio at any given time. And so for me to just leave this wide open text line for listeners to engage, they feel like, is great. I find it sometimes a little overwhelming, but they do text things in that let me know they're listening. They have questions for the person that I'm talking with. They openly disagree with things that are said. Sort of helps me be mindful of those conversations. And every time you make reference to anything that has to do with masks, the thing goes crazy. So I would say that on both sides, by the way, everything today is political. Everything today is political. And for Christians, or anybody operating out of a genuinely faith-based worldview. So I'm going to include there, people who are genuinely Jewish and people who are genuinely Muslim, people of like genuine faith. Their worldview is what is guiding everything else. They are living out of that worldview. People who are, secularist first, humanist first, they are living and operating out of that worldview. And being able to help them identify the difference between the way they are looking at something because of their faith is really helpful. I mean, it's just really helpful for Christians in the culture today to help them see how their faith is influencing and informing the way they are looking at a political question. Because until you tell the fish they are in the water, they don't know what water is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think I would also add it's not just how their faith is influencing their views. It's being able to distinguish between when it's their faith in terms of like the teachings of their faith versus their culture and the culture they grew up in, and sort of identifying that with their faith instead of what is being taught either from the Bible or from their pastor or something like that.
Okay, that's really good, and that's where you'll have to press people beyond sort of a list of talking points they might have read somewhere. That's how you get to that. That's that second layer question. Like, where is that perspective coming from? Or, how does your faith inform that perspective? That forces the person to sort of go to the next layer of the conversation. Or if they've used a term that they then can't define, they're reading off somebody else's crib notes.
So you had brought up the mask issue and the pandemic. Are there any other major issues that you think within sort of the Protestant world that people are really curious about or have questions about or are really passionate about that would be a good topic for me to cover on this podcast?
Trump. Pretty much we are headed into we don't even have 100 days left. So we are headed into the hottest period of time at the intersection of Protestant faith and politics that I think we have ever seen. Christians are more likely to be having a conversation right now about Donald Trump than they are about Jesus. That is a problem. And so he is consuming a lot of the oxygen in the room, and you can't avoid him as a subject matter topic. If you do, people will know you're not being genuine about every headline of the day. However, you also cannot allow everything to either become pro or anti-Trumpian, because that doesn't work either. And so allowing people to struggle, platforming people who would not agree if you had them on together, but you're not going to have them on together. So, but platforming people who would disagree if they were in the room together is probably really healthy, because it allows your listener to overhear, as a third party, a conversation that they are having in their head and don't know how to have in the world, because it's so hostile. It's so hostile right now.
Yeah, definitely. And that's certainly a topic. Everyone who knows me knows that it's been a tremendous topic of mine and one I think about and have written about a lot. But I also know there will be a day when we won't be talking about Trump. And I think there are still lots of other topics that, I know there's lots of other topics that will remain, in the area of Protestants and politics. One of those that's come up recently is just sort of the religious freedom issue related to the pandemic and church closures. And recently the Supreme Court has gotten involved, or actually decided not to get involved, with a case in Nevada where churches felt like they were being treated differently than other types of similarly situated institutions. And the National Association of Evangelicals even has come out with a statement against it, and so forth. At the same time, churches themselves have to struggle with the issue of, whether to meet in person or not, and mask wearing versus not mask wearing, all these sorts of things. So is that a topic that you've heard a lot about, or do you think there's a lot of concern about that among Protestants these days?
I definitely think that the religious liberty conversation is very robust, and there are so many angles from which you can approach that conversation. I think that churches specifically are likely to come out on the positive side of the conversation, because in America we do value the ability to worship. We don't necessarily understand the full liberty that we have in terms of our religious expression in every area of life, but we do seem to understand people should have the freedom to worship in places of worship with people of similar faith. So I do think that one is one that will work itself out. I think there is a really interesting religious liberty conversation on the horizon about religiously affiliated charter schools. So the Supreme Court just recently ruled that you can't discriminate against a charter school because it has a faith basis. We'll see how many groups or how many churches or how many faith-based organizations apply to become charter schools that have a religious basis. But that is going to be a really interesting, robust conversation. 100 years ago, the reason we're having this conversation now is because, there was a point in time that evangelicals didn't want Catholics to be able to get government funding to send their kids to Catholic schools. Well, now the big growth in education is among Protestants who want to be able to send their kids, to evangelical or classical schools that have a Christian emphasis. And these Blaine amendments across the country have stood in the way of that. Well, the Blaine amendment has been struck down, and so we're going to see across the country. I think we're going to see this conversation bubble up, and it's going to reintroduce the conversation about whether or not government funds should be used to support the education of a child in a faith-based school. And, as soon as we say all of that, then the very next conversation will be, I recognize it's a small percentage of the American population, but every Muslim in the country is going to want their child educated in a school that teaches from their faith view, not from an American educational worldview, or a Western worldview. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation, because the religious liberty conversation is not one that just opens the door for Catholics and then Protestant Christians. It opens the door for everyone and the full expression of their faith, even if it's a faith with which I would disagree.
Yeah, definitely. That's a topic that I've also long been concerned about it or interested in, even long before Trump sort of dominated the conversation. So, yeah, that's a really good idea. I definitely want to get some experts in the religious freedom field and so forth to talk about these issues. There's so much conversation around that, and also sort of the issue of whether Christians are being discriminated against in the United States, and all these sorts of conversations and how they relate to what's going on in the judiciary. So we just have a few minutes left. So just tell me what's going on in your life. What do you have coming up on your show? What are some things people can look forward to if they want to listen into your podcast or your radio show? What's going on with you?
Well, I talk to a range of people, and we cover whatever the headlines of the day are. So, tomorrow we'll literally be covering whatever happens today, tonight, tomorrow morning before we go on the air. And then there are times when we settle into a subject matter area with an individual because they have a particularly deep expertise in that field. And so those conversations, tend to be focused on an article or a piece that they have recently written, or some substantive research that's done in an area, obviously, that's not necessarily headline driven. So, today we did the Pew Research God and the global. See, I have already forgotten because that was like 10 hours ago. Yeah. So people's view of God around the world and how that influences, how they function. And there's so many economic conversations related to that, in terms of whether or not people have a functioning faith and how that influences the economics of a nation. But then in reverse, as people get richer and as nations get richer, they walk away from whoever their God was. And that's interesting, right? And so that we've talked recently with a number of folks across that subject matter area. Ross Douthat has been talking about decadence and how, once you reach this point of decadence in a society, that a devolution begins. John Kingston's got a book out right now, almost on exactly that same subject matter area. He just talks about the decline of nation states when they reach the place where they're not just walking away from God. They've literally reached the point where they believe they can function without God. And so, I would look at a headline, let's say right now, that is telling us that Americans are interested in having leaders who are moral and ethical, but not necessarily religious. Well, once you've divorced ethics and morality from religion, you literally just have pragmatism. You have whatever we as the people imagine in any given moment is of utilitarian best for whoever among us is in charge. That's bad. That's bad. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we have, in addition to, everything from sports to movies to, I've been talking fairly frequently about Kanye West, right? He's a Christian and he's big in the headline news. So I'm just saying that whatever is popping in the news, what we're trying to do is equip Christians to go into the conversations that are already happening today in the world and to do so in a way that honors Jesus. So how can I equip my listeners to talk about the things that people are going to be talking about today, because it's the big stuff, but to do so in a way that honors Jesus, that Jesus would recognize as consistent with his character, that he would say, yeah, that ambassador is walking that out into the world in a way that I would claim and is consistent with who I am.
Yeah, all that sounds so interesting. So please check out Carpen's show. It's on Faith Radio Network, right? And also on podcasting apps.
Yeah, but they can just come to my website, which is reconnectwithcarmen.com. And it's one-stop shopping. Oh,
great. Yeah, it makes it easy. Can you believe it? I'm a podcaster now.
You're a podcaster. Congratulations.
Done.
Episode 1 is done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for being my first guest.
Absolutely. It was an honor.